Our next speaker is a wildlife biologist and conservationist renowned for his work with apes and elephants. He serves as the Born Free Foundation's representative in the Forest Stewardship Council, and he's an ambassador for the UN's Convention on Migratory Species. He's the head of conservation for the not-for-profit streaming platform Ecoflix, and he is the co-founder director of Rebalance Earth, which aims to drive the transition to a nature-based economy. His focus is on the role of animals, that they play as gardeners of the forest, helping to fight climate change and biodiversity loss, and lifting neighboring communities out of poverty through payment for ecosystem services via the blockchain. Please welcome Ian Redmond.
Thank you. Well, speaking about nature to an audience of people who are very techie might seem a challenge. I don't know, maybe you're all closet naturalists and go out at weekends with binoculars watching wildlife. I was asked to speak about the value of nature, and for most people that is a slightly controversial idea. I've had the good fortune to spend long periods of time in wilderness areas, and I value that on a personal and possibly even a spiritual level, because being at one with nature gives you an inner stillness, you know. So when things are getting really tough, you probably all have your happy places. Maybe it's with a games console in hand on the sofa. I don't know where you find your inner calm, but those values are difficult to put up against the economic values that we have traditionally ascribed to nature, or at least to natural resources. Now, we're just hearing about the technology that we use and the metals and other minerals which are mined to provide us with these things. I'm going to ask a question of you. I recently acquired a Fairphone. Can you stick your hand up in the air if you've heard of Fairphone? Yeah, that's good. And do any of you actually have one in your hand or in your pocket? Well, some of you do. This is an interesting attempt to source the components for the everyday gadget that we all use ethically and sustainably. So the aluminium of the case is certified independently as coming from sustainable sources. Sustainable sources are difficult to define. Mention was made of the Forest Stewardship Council. There is an aluminium equivalent. The other minerals are more difficult. What about the tantalum capacitors? The reason we're enabled to have such slender little devices in our pockets to watch videos and communicate with each other is because of the tantalum capacitors. And most of the Earth's tantalum is found in deposits in the east of the Democratic Republic of Congo, a country I know and love very much, but which is, to put it mildly, troubled. Now, about 23 years ago, I did a little investigation into the illegal coltan trade, because around the time that a new games console was about to be launched, it turned out that there was a global shortage of tantalum, and the price rocketed. And people in the east of the Congo learned that foreigners, literally with briefcases full of dollars, would pay them a lot of money for the heavy grit, the heavy pebbles that they found in their streams, in their fields. And there was a bit of a gold rush, except it wasn't gold, it was black, heavy metal, coltan. And coltan is the columbo-tantalite, the ore from which you can derive tantalum, which is itself a metal, a heavy metal. And when reduced to a powder and coated on a capacitor, it gives that capacitor properties that enable us to have these devices in our pocket. The cost of that gold rush was not only that thousands of people left their jobs, their schools, and went to dig in the forest to find the heavy grit that the foreigners want because it's worth ridiculous amounts of money, but a whole industry of feeding the miners who are doing hard physical labor. We're not talking about machinery here, we're talking about pickaxes and shovels, digging holes in the ground, trying to find the deposits of this stuff that someone in the world wants to make loads of money out of. These are the most profitable industries in the world, telecommunications and entertainment, all depending on this heavy metal grit that people were digging up in the Congo. And to feed the miners, they would hire hunters who would go out and kill any large mammal, elephants, gorillas, chimpanzees, buffalo, antelope. After a year or two, the hunters weren't finding large mammals. They were coming in with tortoises and porcupines and whatever they could find. And they weren't selling the meat for money, they were selling it for coltan, by the cup. All of this happening in the Congo 20 years ago so that we can have these devices in our pocket. And the efforts of the guerrilla organization to set up a dialogue between the miners, the buyers, and the industry that wants the tantalum met with very little success because there wasn't the engagement that we want. Perhaps today those industries would respond better. There are now efforts within the UN to approve of mining outfits that are not using child labor, that are not using forced labor, slave labor, that are not terrorizing villages and occupying areas of land. But in the east of the DRC, sadly, there are still bad guys with guns trying to control territory to get natural resources out to the world. And the people in this room, we're all part of that. But none of us want to be. None of us want to be funding terrorism in the Congo. And yet we haven't somehow managed to sort out a system of certification that would allow that to happen. So what about the nature? If the minerals under the ground are worth more than the trees and the animals above the ground, then traditionally the trees and the animals have had to go. And we've been doing that across the planet, as you all know, throughout our lifetime. We've been watching stories of deforestation and efforts to stem that. The latest one being this Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, which is the most awful title for something which is of huge importance to our economy. So last week I had the good fortune to be in Rwanda. Can we cue the first video, just to entertain you?
By photos.
Here we go, look at that. What you're looking at is a couple of adolescent gorillas.
Really?
Just fooling about, roughhouse play,
Diarrhea. Uh-oh.
laughing, thumping each other, having fun. And these are habituated to humans because they, throughout their life and their parents' lives, have learned that, well, since really 1979, humans have posed less of a threat and are more just a part of their environment. So
There's something called a gorilla.
the value that has is that people are prepared to pay money to go and watch this kind of fun behavior. It's fun because we recognize a lot of our own behavior in it. Anyone who's watched a couple of teenage lads roughhouse playing would immediately recognize something in what you're seeing here.
Okay. Oh, we have
But the value of these gorillas is now considered so great that if you want to go and see them in Rwanda, you will have to pay $1,500 for a permit that will give you 1 hour in the company of these amazing animals. Now that's extraordinary because $1,500 is a lot of money in most people's book, and yet it's proven successful. Across the border in Uganda, you only have to pay $700. So some people prefer to go to Uganda. And in the Congo, because of the insecurity, you're advised not to go. And yet the gorillas that have been habituated or used to people are as welcoming, and the guides and the trackers and the communities that depend on the income from that tourism are as welcoming as in Rwanda or Uganda. So is that the value we put on nature? If it's interesting, if it's entertaining, we can go and see it on our holidays. rather relegates gorillas and other animals to the realm of rather attractive ornaments that you might go and visit on holiday if you're lucky enough, or otherwise you might watch on television. Now, we've been watching documentaries on television all of our lives if we live in the developed world. The irony is that people who live in the developing world, where many of these documentaries are made, don't get to see them because their national TV stations can't afford to buy them, and the BBC and National Geographic and Discovery and all these big organizations that make these documentaries don't give them to the countries. You'd think it would be a kind of a lost leader. Oh, we want there to be wildlife in the future so that we can make films in the future. Therefore, we should make people care about the wildlife in the countries where the wildlife lives. It has been very difficult to get that idea live. Beginning to see little changes. And maybe when you go into a hotel in Africa or Southeast Asia or Amazonia, you might, instead of seeing music videos or sport or news or old movies, you might actually see some natural history. And when you see an audience of people in Africa looking at natural history documentaries, their wide-eyed wonder is the same as ours. Of course it is, because this is fascinating stuff. But is that a value? Should some proportion of the natural history filmmakers' profits be put back into protecting the animals? Well, it'd be a nice idea. And a lot of the filmmakers are ardent naturalists and would probably support that. But the bean counters in head office who are trying to make a profit, that's what companies do, or spend the license fee wisely, if it's what the BBC does, then it's difficult for them to justify giving stuff away. And yet it's so important that people care about the wildlife. One of the reasons we set up EcoFlix, which is like a charitable version of Netflix, but it's just eco, so to do with animals and the planet. Have a look at ecoflix.com. It's free to schools. It's to provide people with information which is both entertaining and accurate so that they can make better decisions in their life. And we've been hearing about the importance of that in relation to technology. What do we buy, and are we actually helping to pay for the destruction of nature? But I want to go beyond the potential ecotourism value and the sort of the guilt value, oh, we don't want to destroy nature because it's nice, and look at what nature actually does for us. Let's play the second video and see what comes up now. This is also a gorilla. This is a western lowland gorilla. And this fellow is eating fruit. My favorite video title, Gorilla Eats Fruit and Leaves. He will leave in a minute. But the reason that that's important is that apes and other primates and elephants and some birds are seed dispersal agents. They play this important role in tropical forests where between 75 and 96% of tree species depend on animals to disperse their seeds. These are the gardeners of the forest. They are swallowing seeds which are then digested partially and then deposited in their droppings the next day, miles from the parent plant. And in the case of gorillas, there you go, he's off. He's eaten the fruit and he's left. That's the end of that one. But you could probably go straight into the next one, because if gorillas are the second most important seed dispersal agent in African forests where they live, and there are 10 countries in Africa with gorillas, elephants are the most important. And there are 50 countries across Africa and Asia that have elephants as the mega gardeners of the forest. Now, because the elephants are so big and impressive, and just so weird in their anatomy, and so intelligent in their cognitive powers, a brain 4 times the size of ours, living in complex societies, speaking across miles of bush or forest using infrasonic vocalizations, which they can either hear through their ears or through their feet, seismic sensors in their feet. I mean, just extraordinary creatures. And so, of course, many people want to go and see them on their holidays, and that gives them a value through ecotourism. But in the Congo Basin forests, it's very hard for tourists to get to see elephants because it's so dense. And here I want to stress the true value of elephants. Do you want to just stop the video there? Well, back a little bit. I'm going to do this live for you. You don't have to listen to me doing that. What you saw there was a seed bed. i.e. a pile of elephant poo that had slightly decomposed and was starting to germinate the seeds from that elephant's meal the day before it deposited the poo. And that is really important. It's particularly important for elephants in forests because their behavior enhances the forest's ability to sequester and store carbon and perform many other ecosystem services. So if we can get beyond the fact that these animals are fascinating and beyond the fact that they can be a source of revenue for communities and for governments through ecotourism, think about what they actually do. They're keeping the biosphere healthy. Now, an Italian biologist called Fabio Bazzaghi did a study in the Congo Basin comparing the above-ground biomass, that is basically the amount of wood, in a forest which still has forest elephants, and a similar forest where they were extirpated decades ago. And he found between 7 and 14% more above-ground biomass where there were elephants. Why is that? Well, he concluded that because elephants are feeding on the green vegetation, which hasn't got that much carbon in it, and then producing voluminous piles of poo, which fertilizes the big trees that are not eaten, then they are gardening, that they are doing the weeding. Think about it, if you grow vegetables, you don't want all the wildflowers seeds blowing into your garden and smothering your vegetables. You want to pick out the unwanted plants, put them on a compost heap, and when they've rotted down, you put those nutrients back on your vegetables. That's what elephants and gorillas and chimpanzees and antelope in these forests are doing every day. They're eating the low-carbon vegetation and fertilizing the big old trees which continue to sequester and store carbon. But it's not just about carbon. It is so frustrating to hear politicians just talk about carbon because trees do so much more than store carbon. Evapotranspiration, the pushing of water vapor into the atmosphere. And this is where it starts to get really interesting because you might think, well, that's all very nice and academic and happening in Africa and has no relation to us. Play the last video, please, because this is an animated global map of precipitation. And the orange is actual water falling out of the sky. The white is water vapor, which of course you can't see, but let's go with the white is the water vapor. And it's speeded up. Look at the clock in the top right-hand corner, and you can see the days are ticking by at roughly 1 a second. And every day there's a sort of a pulse in the Congo Basin, which is the rainfall. Of course, it's a rainforest. It rains in a rainforest, but it doesn't just rain in the rainforest. It sets up weather systems which move west across the Atlantic, and African rain falls in Amazonia. I didn't know that until I saw this animation, and the bigger pulse of the Amazon basin is sending off weather systems to water South Africa or Australia or New Zealand, or if going off to the north, watering the Corn Belt in the Midwest and sweeping across the Atlantic to water Britain and Europe. This is connecting all these things together in a way which is enlightening, because water is not talked about enough by politicians and decision makers. Obviously, we all need it, not just to drink, but because it waters our crops, and it fills our aquifers, and it powers our hydropower. Now, if you get your electricity from, say, Scottish hydropower, do you think any proportion of what you pay for your lecky goes to protect the elephants and the gorillas in the Congo Basin that are planting the trees that in years to come will be pumping water around the world and filling the hydro schemes in Scotland? Not a penny. There is no valuation of that ecosystem service that every one of us benefits from. And that's why the Rebalance Earth initiative is a rather interesting take on that. Because using the calculations that Fabio did of what a difference a herd of elephants makes to a forest's ability to perform these ecosystem services, Ralph Sharmy, who at the time was the assistant director at the International Monetary Fund, but recently retired, Ralph calculated that value works out at about $1.75 million per elephant over the course of his or her life, which might be, say, 60 years. So roughly $30,000 a year or $80 a day, if the elephant was being paid for the service it's providing to the world. But of course, no one's paying that. And we're in the process of setting up a feasibility study to try and make that happen. Identify a measurable difference that keystone species that hold the whole ecosystem together, make to our lives, and then get companies to pay for that. Just as when they calculate the cost of their goods and services, they work out, well, how much do we have to have in hand to pay the cleaner and to fix the plumbing when the loos go wrong, and pay the accountant and all the people involved in the business who aren't actually manufacturing the stuff that you sell. All those comes into the price. But nowhere in that calculation is the value for the ecosystem services, which can be traced back to, in some cases, individual animals in the oceans, the great whales, and in the forests of Africa and Asia, the elephants. So watch this space. This is coming. We're working on it. Has proved more challenging than we thought. It's funny, isn't it? You think you're going to change the global economy, you just need a few calculations on the back of an envelope, and suddenly people want more. But it will come. And I sincerely hope that within a very short space of time, when you buy a product, be it a Fairphone or some other device, part of the price that you pay is going to pay for the ecosystems that sustain us all. Because that, much as it's fun to take people to see gorillas on holiday, much as it's fascinating to watch documentaries about them, the real value is what they do every day, even the ones that aren't visited by tourists. So I want every gorilla and every orangutan and every rhino to be valued for what they do for the ecosystem, and for us clever humans to construct a system that allows that to happen. And then we fill what has been described as the biodiversity funding gap. Another sexy title. The difference between what we spend at the moment on protecting nature and what we should spend if we want nature to continue to protect us, which at the last count was estimated about $700 billion a year. Which is a lot of money. It's not going to come out of the government's coffers. It's not going to come out of philanthropy. But it could come out of the global economy if we construct it thus. So there's our challenge. You don't have to do it all today, but think about that. Have a look at rebalance.earth and get involved. Whatever companies you work for, they need to be thinking about this stuff, and we are keen to help them pay for these ecosystem services in a way that delivers, using blockchain, those payments to the communities who live in or around their habitat and who have a vested interest, therefore, in protecting the animals as they are alive in that habitat, rather than, as traditionally has happened, some foreigner comes and wants the big trees, some foreigner comes and wants the elephant's front teeth, somebody comes and wants to kill the animals for meat. Whatever it is, that ends their ability to sustain us, and we have to change that before we run out of animals. That's a simple message. I hope you enjoyed it. You're waiting for me to shut up now, aren't you?
I didn't want to interrupt Redmond. It was so good. Thank you.